just shows what I thought Trump was going to be like. The flip-flopping on security policy, making promises, undercutting previous promises committed, then recommitting, then making it vague, then uncommitting again, and flip-flop, 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 flip-flop. We're getting a lot of that. We're getting a lot of that. We're getting a lot of Russian apologia. We're getting a lot of public concessions. We're getting a lot of piss-poor deal-making from the deal-maker-in-chief. And now he had a meeting with Keir Starmer where he then went back on what his administration was trying to do, which was cleaning up Pete Hegseth's mess. So Pete Hegseth went to Munich, I think it was Munich, but he went to Europe and he spoke to the Europeans. And while speaking to the Europeans, he suggested, while doing this tour of Europe, that NATO membership was off the table for Ukraine. And also that US troops were off the table and a bunch of stuff was off the table. And then others reacted to this negatively because some people within the Republican Party still have some sense of how, diplomacy works or geopolitics works. There might be a diplomat or two within the entire apparatus of the Republican Party, and they're realizing, like, wait a second, you don't want to give that up right off the bat unless you get concessions. And so Pete Hegseth then went out in public, the unexperienced Fox News host, and was wait, let me just reel this back a second. It's just a state. I didn't take. If this is, I don't want to take away the options of the president, and, I don't want to take away from his leverage and yada, yada, and he reeled it back. And then Donald Trump had this meeting with Keir Starmer, and then he worked to undo all that backpedaling and then went straight back forward with NATO membership is off the table, as well as a bunch of other stuff. Let's get into it. Let's see a report from PBS on the meeting, and then we're going to take some snippets from the meeting and break them down.
As UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer pulled up to the White House today,
President Trump, can you get a peace deal done in Ukraine?
Yes. Ukraine was top of mind before he and President Trump even got inside. In the Oval Office,
we're going to be discussing many things today.
Starmer, the Labour Party leader, made his pitch for the U.S. to include Ukraine and all of Europe in negotiations.
We want to work with you to make sure that peace deal is enduring, that it lasts, that it's a deal that goes down as a historic deal, that nobody breaches.
But for his tougher asks, Starmer brought a sweetener, a letter direct from King Charles, inviting Trump for a historic second state visit 7 years after his first.
The answer is yes. On behalf of our wonderful First Lady, Melania, and myself, the answer is yes.
From there, Trump gave a show.
Can I just throw something out there quick? So I believe that, yes, to some extent, you're going to have to flatter Trump. I think the former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, as, for example, the head of NATO, was a great pick. He's somebody who's widely considered like a Trump whisperer. I think he's going to do the job well. I would have preferred an Eastern European, but outside of an Eastern European, I think he's probably the best next pick, definitely when it comes to dealing with Trump. And yes, that's going to come with some flattery and saying, you're smart enough to know that the Russians want X, Y, and Z, and, negotiation takes X, this. So what pathway should we take? Should we do good? There's a way you would have to talk to him that I understand that will include some amount of flattery, but don't think that you just give him oh, come meet the queen, or well, I guess no, come meet the king. Oh, come over to our country, have some beans and toast, and we'll flatter you, and you go fish, and we'll come spend some time at your magnificent hotel. Don't think that's all gonna lead to him giving you what you want. And I'm not saying that doesn't help him have a better view of you if you're nice to him. Like if you go in there and say, sup, cunt, I think he's not going to take you kindly. But the problem is, if you go in there and you start brown-nosing him, you don't think that no matter how unintelligent somebody might think Donald Trump is in certain areas, like, for example, geopolitics or Eastern European history or any of the things that he is putting his fingers in like he's an expert. But you don't think he can see groveling when he sees it? You don't think he can see brown-nosing when he sees it? And how do you think he reads that? Do you think he reads that as, oh, this is a strong ally for me who I can work with on a productive basis to get things done because I like him personally? Or do you think he smells blood in the water? He sees weakness and he thinks, how much can I bleed this man dry until he's a stone? I think it's the latter. I really do. And I think part of the reason that he's so friendly with the with the foreign authoritarians and the oligarchs like Putin and the Orban, is because they kind of have they do give off the air of, you know, the type of strongman like aesthetic that he likes. They know how to flatter him enough by just kind of like treating him like one of the boys, but he also like treats them and he sees them like killers. Like, these are tough guys, you know, and he sees their displays of toughness through mafia-esque actions that he can basically understand, that are too base for him not to understand. And so if you just come up to him and you just brown nose him, he's gonna run over you. And I know this is maybe a little unorthodox, definitely if I'm saying this of U.S. allies, but I think you need to bloody the nose of the U.S. president slightly. I think that you need to do what Malcolm Turnbull did and what others did, which isn't like, come up, fuck you, but you like be clear, like, no, this is my interest. I have to do this. You know, if you stand strong and you show clear to him where your interests lie, then he's going to act differently near them. That's how Zelensky went from a deal where he was going to have to give up half of Ukraine's natural wealth, critical ports, critical infrastructure, $500 billion for about $110 billion worth of aid. I mean, that's like 2 to 3 times greater than Ukraine's GDP. And he went from that to a joint investment fund, getting wealth from the Ukrainian materials, which then invests into the Ukrainian economy and then goes back into the investment fund. They went from America is extracting resources from Ukraine like a colony in exchange for its support, but I would say lackluster considering the price tag. And that changed to a joint investment deal between the United States and Ukraine for rebuilding, where that's where the money goes. See, and that was done through Zelensky saying no, standing out in public. And then you want to know what Trump did? He sent out Mike Waltz. Mike Waltz went out there and he said they need to shut up and take the deal. You had his base going out there, hitting the war drum. Boom, boom, boom. Trump must be strong again. Trump must be tough again. Like he was against the Mexicans. No, he wasn't. Like he was against the Canadians. No, he wasn't. And then once that drumbeat has gone on for about a week, once there's been enough lambasting of the Ukrainians, once Trump has called Zelensky a dictator while refusing to call Putin one, then eventually they accept a new deal, a new compromise solution, which is much closer to Ukraine's interests, while also well within Trump's interests. So instead of bleeding Ukraine like a stone, they worked with them from an advantageous position. And that was only done by Zelensky saying no and not just brown-nosing and rolling over. In fact, you want to know what I would have done? And maybe this would have been a little, I don't know, controversial, but I think either Keir Starmer or Emmanuel Macron should have told Trump that they will veto his UN resolution if it does not include a direct condemnation of the Russians in the resolution. And if not, he shouldn't try to pass it at all. Now, it could have been one of them. All you need is one of them to test the water. One plays good cop, one plays bad cop. But you gotta show that you're deeply, deeply interested in protecting Ukrainian interests and European interests, and you're willing to back it up with force. And that's why Europe has prepared retaliatory measures when it comes to, for example, sanctions. You just got to be willing to pull the trigger on it. Definitely since Trump, in his recent first cabinet meeting, talked about 25% sanctions against the European Union across the board, which, because they don't take enough agricultural goods, even though they're a fourth largest agricultural trading partner.
Wonderful First Lady Melania and myself, the answer is yes.
From there, Trump gave a show of confidence that a peace deal between Kyiv and Moscow would hold. Starmer, as well as French President Emmanuel Macron, have both agreed to send troops to the region to keep the peace if a deal is reached. The U.S., on the other hand,
I don't think we're going to even be necessary, but I don't think there'll be any problem with keeping the deal, with the security.
Earlier this week, Starmer announced UK's defense budget will rise to 2.5% by 2027, a move clearly aimed at pleasing Trump.
We get along very famously, as you would say.
And this is under the Labour Prime Minister. This is increasing defense spending right now seems to be a bipartisan issue in British politics. And so is supporting Ukraine. I don't know if you guys saw, but Nigel Farage, longtime Ukraine critic, I don't know if he if this shows some actual shift in him. I doubt it. But it might just be him noticing the political winds. He says that Ukraine being inside of NATO is probably essential for a peace deal. Nigel Farage, Brexit Nigel Farage, believes Ukraine has to be in NATO for a peace deal. So it shows the amount of bipartisanship that is in British politics over support for Ukraine. And it also shows Nigel Farage trying to somewhat normalize his party so they can actually try to overtake the Conservatives, in my opinion. Even if he doesn't personally believe it, and I still think that he probably is a Russia apologist in sheep's clothing.
But as Trump praised Starmer, he indicated he trusts Russian President Vladimir Putin to stick to any peace deal.
I've known him for a long time now, and I think he will. I don't believe he's going to violate his word.
That in stark contrast to how Starmer and the UK has viewed Putin, as the press noted.
It sounds as though one of you completely trusts President Putin and one of you doesn't trust him an inch.
At the same time, Trump played up his relationship with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
By the way, can I just throw this out there? Like, Trump didn't just like a little bit say he trusts Putin. He kept saying he trusts Putin again and again and again. He keeps saying this recently. And honestly, this is stupid. This is really stupid. Now, it might be good for short-term politics, but like, if Trump cares at all about his brand, if they relaunch the war, then Trump was shown to be a liar. And so if he makes a shaky foundation and they restart the war, he'll be shown to be a liar. The problem is, like, I think that'll hurt him. Maybe he thinks he could just lie his way out of that and just say, like, well, the reason they started the war is because the Democrats, they thought they were going to win the election. Or, well, the Democrats recently won that election, and now, J.D. Vance lost in 2028, so they invaded because Democrats came in. I was keeping the peace. Even though he built the foundations for war by building a shaky foundation. He'll sell it either way. But, like, when he talks about, like, trusting Putin, like, how much he trusts Putin, it's not going to play well. I don't care how much he pivots it. If people can say, I trust Putin, there won't be a war, he won't relaunch it, he won't do this, he won't do that, and then you can just splice that followed by Ukraine being invaded by tanks. I mean, we saw how those people were humiliated, like Hassan and Mearsheimer at the start of the invasion when they said it was impossible Ukraine was going to get invaded. Then they got invaded. Some people still choose to take these people seriously on the issue. But for a moment, people saw the truth about the matter. So I hope the same thing would be true. But to say that you trust a man who's already violated these agreements like twice is not pushing towards an agreement or diplomacy. It comes off as dumb naivete. That's what it comes off as.
At the same time, Trump played up his relationship with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who will be in Washington tomorrow to sign off on a critical minerals deal. Reporters pointed out comments Trump clearly made about Zelensky online just last week.
Mr. President, do you still think that Mr. Zelensky is a dictator?
Did I say that? I can't believe I said that.
Trump stood by.
This is what the next 4 years is going to be, by the way. Trump says something, he has an effect on the public, he informs the public, Zelensky's a dictator. And then some people in his base was like, I knew it, I heard this on the Tucker Carlson show, and they go with it. It undermines Ukraine's support in the United States. And then once he's gotten the diplomatic leverage he thought he was getting by just like lying about the people he was negotiating against, in this instance, Ukraine, then afterwards it's like, oh, what? No, I never said, I don't know what you mean. What? He does the damage and then pretend he never did anything. He said it, we all saw it. He just thinks this is funny. And I looked into MAGA space and how they were reacting to it. They thought this was funny too. They think it's funny to just call him a dictator and then reel it back in. They think it's funny to make people think, oh, democracy doesn't matter. Democracy doesn't matter in this struggle. There's no difference between having no civil society and having a civil society. There's no difference between being able to be in Ukraine and say Zelensky's a cunt and not being able to do that in Russia and say Putin's a cunt. There's like no difference between these things, right? That this false equivalence is damaging to the Ukrainian cause. Deeply damaging. Oh my goodness. A piece of dust just went in. Anyway, it's highly damaging to the Ukrainian cause. And he doesn't even want to take credit for doing that damage.
His push for tariffs, including with Europe. And throughout, both leaders stressed the importance of a strong U.S.-UK alliance. But Trump, not so subtly, reminded his counterpart about their relative strength.
Could you take on Russia by yourselves?
Well,
Awkward moments became more open disagreement when a reporter asked about Vice President Vance's criticisms of the UK. Earlier,
Here's a question. Could the United States take on Russia without Europe? Could the United States take on China economically without Europe? If Europe doesn't participate in any of the sanction regimes against China, definitely when Germany already has like a manufacturing crisis in the car sector, many countries are already dealing with economic problems, and you want them to shut off the country's largest exporter from going into their countries because of a crisis in Taiwan when we won't care about their own backyard? Look, I'm not like a Europe-a-boo. I don't know what you would call it, a Europa-boo. I'm not in here saying all hail the European Union or whatever. What I am saying is that if you just treat like the European Union's people as a bunch of limp-wristed pencil necks who don't know what they're doing and have no leverage because their military spending has been dog doo-doo up to this point, what you're going to end up doing is forget the real leverage that they have, and then you're going to isolate yourselves in future diplomatic crises, and it's going to be difficult for you to, you know, for example, if you want to actually challenge the Chinese economically to dissuade an invasion, it's going to be more difficult to rally the Europeans if you weren't there for them. If you aren't there for them, why are they going to be there for you? Especially if it's not in their economic interest to be there for you. Point is, it's my general point is just like having allies is good. And it is true that like the United Kingdom alone wouldn't be able to take down Russia, but it also wouldn't be the United Kingdom alone.
this month, Vance decried the UK as censoring free speech, particularly religious expression. Today, Vance seemed focused on the internet and how to handle inflammatory, sometimes threatening speech, arguing British policy blocking some was a U.S. concern.
What the British do in their own country is up to them, but also affect American technology companies and by extension American citizens. So that is something that we'll talk about today at lunch. Okay, but if we're saying that, then let me just throw this out there. Does that mean that for all the call of deporting those who protested against Israel at like campuses, or what they say pro-Hamas protesters or whatever, across college campuses, deporting their citizens, does that mean that they could deport their American citizens from their countries if they do protests or stuff that they don't like? Let's say somebody was to, I don't know, like do some like really crazy red pill protest, or I don't know what it would be, and they would deport them. Could they make that call? Like, this can become reciprocal. And if there's anything that could encourage the Europeans to unite as a bloc, in one way, I think actually being between the Russians and the Americans and being in this problem, this strategic crisis, it's bad in most ways. The one way it's good is that it might wake the Europeans up towards some bloc unity. But if that's the case, then it's going to make it much harder for us to strong-arm any of these countries on a unilateral basis.
Starmer immediately responded with a polite back off.
Well, no, I mean, certainly we wouldn't want to reach across US citizens, and we don't, and that's absolutely right. But in relation to free speech in the UK, I'm very proud of our history there. This has been a very good and very productive visit.
Side by side at an afternoon news conference, the two leaders continued working on the latest version
Thank you very much.
of their country's special relationship.
Now, there's one thing that PBS chose not to include that I think that they should have included, and it was the problem I was showing earlier, or I was talking about earlier, which is that Pete Hegseth went out there, said no NATO for Ukraine, that he walked it back after backlash from within his party and outside his party, saying you're undermining your leverage before negotiations, who went out public and said I would never want to undermine the president, and then the president went out there and next to Keir Starmer, undermined himself in negotiations, taking it off the table, giving himself less leverage. Art of the deal, everyone. Art of the deal. He had a chance to save himself, and he chose to disregard it.
The Europeans want Ukraine to be part of NATO as part of this deal. Are you willing to budge on that at all, or is it a firm?
Well, I could be very nice and say, oh, well, we'll work to it. Look, it's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. That's what started this whole thing. Biden said that, and all of a sudden the gun started. That was one of the primary reasons it started. And this was long before President Putin. They never said it was an impossibility. So we can say, oh, gee, well, we'll try, but that's something that's just not going to happen. And then the other question I ask is about the land. Will you get your land back? Well, they've fought long and hard on the land, and you and I will be discussing that, and we're going to certainly try and get as much as we can back. But on the NATO, it's just not, that's not going to happen. Yeah, please.
The second part, I mean, like, if you're trying to find a silver lining here, hearing like we're going to try to get as much of the land back isn't the worst thing you could hear. The worst thing you could hear is, I mean, like, Russia's annexed it. I mean, it's there. You know, the worst thing you could hear is like, oh shit, does that mean they're giving up Kherson? Like, I could imagine worse things, but let's not hold ourselves to the standard of, let's hold the president of the United States. He's not literally pushing Ukrainians while calling them coal holes in the camp. So let's, oh, woohoo, yay. You know, no, we're not doing that. We're going to hold the president to a higher standard than that, because we should hold the president to a higher standard than that, because he's the president of the United States. So the first thing here is, okay, before we get into like Trump's fantastic historical acumen, let's just get into like the basics of negotiating here. The Russians want things. The Americans want things. What do the Americans want in a perfect world? Well, in a perfect world, they would want the Russians out of Ukraine. They would want Ukraine, I imagine, if we're talking about all of Ukraine and its alliance, if we're talking about this whole alliance, they would want Ukraine to get its land back. And they would want to set up a foundation that would stop Russia from invading Ukraine again, right? Russia out of Ukraine, Ukraine get its land, build up foundation for peace, and rebuilding project. Now, there's some other stuff like the returning of children, POWs, for example, accountability for war crimes. But those are like the big ticket issues that everyone's discussing and are the biggest sticking point. Even though the Russians are never going to turn over their war criminals, they're going to want to give them medals on state TV for the next 2 to 3 decades, calling the Bucha massacre perpetrators like heroes on radio programs and award them and stuff. Because that's the culture. That's the political culture that's currently in Russia. Now, if you want those things, the only way you can get those things is if you convince the Russian that the only way that they'll get what they want is by giving at least some of those things up to some extent, partially or totally. For example, you want NATO not in Ukraine, then you got to give Ukraine its land back. That right there, boom. If you talk to Ukrainians and hey, no NATO membership, but you get back all your land, what I'm sure most would almost certainly take it, honestly. Now, they probably would want some agreement to stop a future invasion, maybe a unilateral defense pact between France and Germany and the United Kingdom and Ukraine, whatever it would be, unilateral defense pact instead of NATO and to stop future invasions or whatever. That would be an instance of compromise because you're giving up, you're using your leverage to get something you want, and they're using their leverage to get something they want, which is NATO out of Ukraine. This is a very broad strokes idea. This is not like my proposal for the peace solution. My point is, this is generally how negotiations are supposed to work. And before the negotiations have really started, they're just like, when I say before they've started, I mean they're just getting underway. As in like, they're just starting to meet, the delegations are just starting to meet in Istanbul. They're just starting like the diplomatic missions. They haven't even really started like drawing the lines or whatever. They haven't even started that. And we already have given up NATO membership. We've already given up American troops in Ukraine, which is the deterrence leverage. We've already given up leverage when it comes to the Russians wanting an election in Ukraine and the end of martial law so Ukrainian men can flee, which is what I think is what they want. Of course, maybe you think that Vladimir Putin cares about Ukrainian democracy and that Donald Trump cares about the liberalization and democratization of the Ukrainian state. Maybe that's the planet you're on, but I am on planet Earth, okay? You've given up that. You've given up so much when it comes to Ukraine and its basic interests of wanting to be at the table. That is a big point. That's a big point for the Ukrainian people. 91% of Ukrainians say that they don't want to do a peace deal if they're not at the table negotiating, right? That's a huge concession, them not being at the table. No troops, no NATO, no, they're not at the table to discuss their own future. They're probably not getting all their land back. Another concession they made publicly. And something he's kind of reiterating a bit here. We're going to try to get all of it. We're going to try to get as much as we can. Not we're going to try to get all of it back. And he didn't even attempt to say at one point he's going to try that, a deal for deal. He's setting the standard that Russia's going to keep stuff right off from the get-go. It's just giving up leverage, giving up leverage, giving up leverage, giving up leverage. And so where is this art of the deal? Where is this deal maker in chief? Okay? Because if that deal maker in chief or that deal maker from somewhere around him doesn't step off, Keith Kellogg doesn't grab the steering wheel and turn it this way or turn it that way, Donald Trump might, well, hit the iceberg, sink the peace deal, and then we'll have war through 2025. And you want to know what? I think that's a very probable outcome. In talks with Russia, Trump repeats his Afghanistan playbook. Trump's negotiation strategy in Afghanistan resulted in capitulation to the Taliban, abandoning of U.S. allies. Experts see strong parallels to how he's dealing with Russia today. When they know you want out and they know you won't stay in, it's just a waiting game. And let me just tell you, as Trump is giving up all this leverage, as Trump is brown-nosing the Russians both diplomatically and publicly about their history, while that's all going on, the Russians are escalating the war.